To talk about his new book, I'm delighted to welcome Lama Jampa Thaye, who is one of the eminent Western authorities on Tibetan Buddhism. Lama Jampa Thaye is an accomplished scholar and practitioner who's received a rigorous Buddhist education under some of the greatest spiritual masters from Tibet. He's one of very few lamas from the West who's received the qualifications of the Vajra master. He's the author of numerous books on Tibetan Buddhism, translated into many different languages, and he maintains a busy international program of teachings of traditional Tibetan texts in English to vast numbers of students around the world. Lama Jampa Thaye is also a qualified academic with a doctorate in the history of Tibetan Buddhism and has a deep knowledge of the history of Western ideas. His understanding of Western philosophy, art and literature, together with his learning as a Buddhist master, makes him one of very few individuals equipped to explain the meeting point of these two great traditions of thought, the interaction between the Buddhist tradition and Western civilization. To talk more about his new book, Wisdom in Exile, Buddhism and Modern Times, Lama Jampa Thaye.
So, if I talk about how the book developed, how it took shape, then in a way that will probably suffice as an introduction to what motivated what's in the book and what contribution I hope it's going to make for the Dharma, for Buddhism in the West. Some years ago, the US Buddhist magazine Tricycle asked me to write some articles for their online blog and also something for their print magazine. And of course, necessarily they were fairly short pieces about different aspects of the Buddhist situation in the West, how Buddhism might be understood, particular issues that might be difficult for people or might need pointing out. And so I prepared those. Of course, in hindsight, I began to realize there was something of a unity to those pieces. But at the same time also, I was doing something else that was rather unusual for me. That is that the BBC Radio Manchester, I'm sure you're all very keen listeners to Radio Manchester on Sunday morning, they asked me to contribute to their early Sunday morning programme. So I did this from time to time over a 3 or 4 year period, every few months. I'd in effect create a Buddhist homily to be squeezed in between the records of Christian soft rock. And the occasional masterpiece from Otis Redding that the very pleasant BBC presenter would insert there. So there are those things going on, those kind of homilies, which were deliberately not so much explicit Buddhist teaching, but really, if you like, something religious about things that would resonate with a general non-Buddhist audience. But they were there, they were lying around. And then the Sakya Dechen Ling, which is the major Karma-Kagyu centre in Europe, founded by the 16th Karmapa. I've been teaching there for several years. And a couple of years ago, when it was their 40th anniversary, they asked me, because usually I teach, as Benjamin was really saying, I teach kind of very traditional Tibetan texts, the things that I was tutored in by my own masters. But because it was their 40th anniversary, they wanted to do something special that year. And so what they asked me to do was to talk about why is there a space for Buddhism at this moment in Western culture. And so that caused me to, so it was a 2-day thing, so that caused me to think quite a bit about this question of, well, where is the opening for Buddhism in the West? Why is there an opening? What has Buddhism got to bring? I mean, of course, I've been a Buddhist for almost all my life now. So in a way, that's a question I've never needed to ask myself. I know why I'm a Buddhist. But asking that question in a way, in the sense of, well, what for our culture does Buddhism bring that isn't in our culture, or isn't operating in our culture? That was quite interesting. So I prepared a kind of a two-day seminar on that, and eventually kind of we typed up the notes from that. So things were now, although I didn't realise it, things were beginning to shape up for this new book. And then last year they asked me to do another one, and this time about a more Buddhist topic in a way, about love and kindness and compassion. But still, that was, again, they wanted it to be aimed at a general public rather than explicitly a Buddhist practicing public. So I undertook that, and again we made some notes. And then finally, the final piece in this jigsaw is when one of my students in LA is involved in the film business, which almost everybody in LA is, apart from those waiting on tables and waiting to be called into the film business. Well, Dan asked me to do something. I think he was, without giving away his political position, he was a little bit disappointed by how things were going last year. This is in June, by the way. This is in June, and so I asked you to give a lecture in LA to cheer people up with the title "Why Politics Doesn't Matter." Now, I never talk about politics, and I'm not going to break that exception, but anyway, I kind of manfully, if that's the right word, rose to this challenge of giving this very unusual lecture for me on why politics doesn't matter. And actually, of course, what I really wanted to say is that Dharma is most important. Buddhism is most important. It transcends anything, and so, don't be disappointed. Really look to the Dharma. So by the end of all these things, really, in a way, we had a book. And it was a book about exactly, what the subtitle says, Buddhism and Modern Times. In other words, what does Buddhism bring to us, Westerners, because by and large we are Westerners? What unique thing does Buddhism bring to us, first of all? And to talk about that, I had, in a way, to, as Benjamin alluded to, in a way, rehearse why there's a space for Buddhism in our culture. Now, far be it from me to criticise in other religions and systems and so on, but it seems to me that, in a way, there is an openness and a need, an openness to the Buddhism in the West, because, in a way, our systems of thought, the systems that give meaning to life, in a way, are not doing that job. I'd say, in a way, they never could do the job as well as Buddhism, of course, because I'm a Buddhist. But in a way, things seem to have dried up in the West in terms of rooted spiritual values. So to talk about that, I really talked a little bit about what I think have been the significant changes in Western culture in the last few hundred years. In a way, and that took me back to the 16th century, at the time of the Reformation, which handily enough allowed me to use that 2 years I spent doing theology in the first 3 years of my undergraduate degree to finally make use of that. And all that knowledge of Luther and Calvin, which of course to a Catholic child were of course not really names one would use in polite company, but to talk about Luther and Calvin, the Reformation, and what that did, because I think in a way it triggered the beginnings of the modern world, and in fact the move away from a rather organic spirituality, which, for all its faults, I think was present in the medieval period. So in fact, what I wanted to say really was that the two dominant factors ideologically nowadays are politics and science, and why? And so partly I think it's because of the decay that set in with Christianity in the 16th century, and undoubtedly some of the things that science, for instance, said were very important and very powerful things. So I talked about that, but I wanted to talk about the fact that science and political changes have brought great benefit to us, but still there is in the human heart, there's a dissatisfaction, a kind of sense of rootlessness, a sense of loss of meaning, and so on, that material change and progress can't really fill. So there, I think, is where the space is for Dharma. Because even if you could solve all the material problems and social problems in the world, there's still the human heart. And the heart of every sentient being, of course. And there is really the thing that needs to change. As Leonard Cohen says, the human heart must change in a fundamental way. And I don't think science and politics can do that for us. But I think Dharma can. And so that was really, in a way, the first part of the book. Why Buddhism? And my answer is because only Buddhism will get to this. Only Buddhism will get to the human heart. And then that raised the question, but well, how is Buddhism doing in the West? And my next point really was that, well, it's not too bad, but there are dangers. There are dangers for Buddhism. And I think, kind of ironically enough, the dangers are that we Westerners who are neophytes in Buddhism, beginners in Buddhism, we run the risk of not seeing the distinctiveness of what Buddhism has to say to us, of in fact conflating it with precisely those things, politics and science, which have been so dominant in our society for the last couple of 100 years. So that led me, and here I drew partly on what I'd written for Tricycle and partly on newer things I'd written. I wanted to say, well, let's think for a minute. No, Buddhism isn't exactly the same as what, say, for instance, those people who understand science to have all the answers say. No, of course, science has made a great contribution to human happiness and to the abolition of certain types of suffering. But for those who think science is the route to understand the nature of the mind, the nature of the world, the nature of what it is to be a human being, I think we disagree as Buddhists. I think we don't accept that. We think that Buddhism says something far more profound, far more deep than science, with all its undoubted mastery of the physical world, can ever say. So when I hear Buddhists saying, Buddhism either is scientific, among the boosters of Buddhism who say Buddhism should be accepted because it's scientific, I'm cautious. No, Buddhism is rational, for sure. In Buddhism we don't accept blind faith. We want to see things by analysis and reasoning. But to say Buddhism is scientific, no. And therefore those people who say Buddhism must be made scientific to fit in the modern world, Buddhism must accept science, by which they mean, by the way, not science as a way of investigating the world, but scientism, which of course is materialism, then they're telling us that we have to trade in Buddhism for what is basically a philosophy, the philosophy of materialism, which actually isn't that new. It's been around for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Buddha knew of it and refuted the presumptions of materialism. So for those people who think they're advancing Buddhism by saying, and we must eliminate from Buddhism that which is not scientific, I say, no. You mean what is not materialist. Of course Buddhism is not materialism. It is something far more profound and has its reasons for rejecting materialism. Similarly, for those who think, yes, I'm a Buddhist, but Buddhism is exactly the same as a modern political parcel of views or package of views, I say no. Don't think that. Buddhism cannot be fitted into the modern political paradigms. Finally, in the end, to say it loud and proud, Buddhism is not of the right or the left. It's not even of the centre. It is something sui generis. It's something else. Its take on what is the source of suffering is far more profound than what we find in any political system. Politics deals with the external. It cannot help do that. But if we think that politics will abolish suffering, we've already lost the distinctiveness of Buddhism. So I have a chapter that deals with that, how we can pull back. Because from that easy assumption that Buddhism and politics, whatever political party or system it is we espouse, say the same thing. I say no, be cautious. Because actually Buddhism suffered from this quite a few times in history. The assumption by people that Buddhism is saying the same thing as what seems to be dominant politically for them. We should, for instance, learn the lesson from Japan in the middle of the 20th century. There was the assumption, it was very strong in Japanese culture, that Buddhism was identical with Japanese militarism and Japanese chauvinism. Buddhism is not identical with any political system, conservative, liberal, republican, conservative, Labour, Democrat, whatever. Look to the Buddhist teachings and you'll see that. So I wanted to create to maintain this space, because as well as this, what I think would be the destruction of Buddhism before it's even got going by identifying it with scientism, I fear the easy identification of Buddhism with any political system. Just as I would the identification of Buddhism with, say, Christianity or theism. Buddhism is different from that, and I want to insist on that, and therefore create the space in which Buddhism can work. Because if Buddhism is not bringing anything new to us, why should we bother with it? Why should we practice it? If Buddhism is identical to our existing politics, our existing religion, our existing philosophies, it has nothing to say to us. But I believe it has extraordinary things to say to us. Now, having done that, then it occurred to me that really I need to talk about, well, how then should we learn Buddhism? And so I have a couple of chapters really, in a way, dealing with that problem from the negative side. Chapters about what I call conceit and disillusionment. That is, first of all, I think we have to be very careful. How could I put it in a way that doesn't offend any of us? We're rather conceited. We think we know everything, and therefore we think, those of us who are interested in Buddhism, that we probably know all of Buddhism. And I want to say, no, we don't. Let's not assume our assumptions are the same as Buddhism. Let's back off and start fresh. Let's listen to what what Buddha taught, what Dharma is actually saying to us. I mentioned in the book this thing that, for instance, when I came into Buddhism, and actually chapter 1 is very brief chapters about how I did meet Buddhist teachers, but when I came into Buddhism in 1972-73, I was exiting what we used to call, and round here by the way, in Notting Hill, the counterculture, the alternative society. And so, although I opted out of that to start studying and practicing Dharma, so still I carried along many of the assumptions of that alternative world that I'd been somewhat part of. So it was a big shock to me when I heard, first of all, concomitant and Rinpoche, kind of accidentally, that he supported monarchy and liked the Queen. And then the next year from Sakya Dechen Ling that, yes, of course, he also liked monarchy. That was a big shock. Luckily, it wasn't so traumatic for me that I threw the baby out with the bathwater. But the point is, that story is it not that I then felt, oh, therefore I must support monarchy, but just that, hey, I've been assuming things. I've been too presumptuous here, thinking that my hippie culture, my hippie assumptions are Buddhism. And therefore, isn't it that I'm just liking Buddhism because it fits with me? Shouldn't I rethink that and think, what do I need to do? Don't I really need to investigate things properly? Listen to what the Buddha was really teaching, what the great masters are really teaching. So it was quite a kind of a gentle transitional thing for me. But I think it is an issue that we really assume that because we're generally nice people and peaceful people and progressive people, that we like Buddhism, therefore Buddhism must be what we believe really already. But I think Buddhism is far more radical than that. Buddhism wants anything, Buddhism wants us to begin again. Examine everything, take nothing for granted. So let's not smuggle our assumptions into Dharma. And that leads me to a kind of related chapter to that about the question of disillusionment. Because after so many years in Dharma, I've seen people get disillusioned with Buddhism. I've seen people lose confidence and faith in Buddhism. Sometimes you become bitterly opposed to it. Now, there are many reasons why that might happen. From a Dharma point of view, not everybody's karma is really suitable for Dharma. Perhaps they should be following something else. But I think part of that disillusionment, again, is that we carried a lot of assumptions into Buddhism and thought it was a certain thing. And when it turns out not to be, we get angry. Or we carry romantic assumptions into Buddhism. We think Buddhism is like a kind of fairyland and everybody's perfect in it and all the masters are perfect and all the sanghas are perfect. Why do we do that? Because we're not prepared to do the hard work on ourselves. We want somebody to save us, some system to save us, to end up in some kind of perfect utopian state, where Dharma says, look to yourself, look to what causes you suffering, look to your ignorance, look to your disturbing emotions, and try to free yourself from them. So actually, to counter the disillusionment that we might get if we come to Buddhism with the wrong ideas, we need a real disillusionment, not with Buddhism, but with samsara. We need to become profoundly disillusioned with the worldly values. And so that is where I begin in a way in the book to talk about Dharma teaching specifically, particularly the teachings on the four thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma. And so from there the book takes this turn into, yes, the Dharma itself. If we've understood the space for it, if we've understood how not to mangle the Dharma, then how do we learn it? So I then talk about the necessity for finding and studying with teachers. But teachers who themselves are not self-appointed, but actually, in a way, in their teachings and their actions, represent the liberating message of the Buddha. And that then leads me to talk about meditation. Actually, the chapter on meditation came out of something that I did write for Tricycle. And that really allowed me to talk about the distinction between how we should understand the role of meditation in Buddhism as not a standalone practice, but as something that is part of the path. Alongside ethics and wisdom, meditation is one of the three trainings. So the modern fascination with meditation, seen in things like the mindfulness movement and so on, whatever good or bad that is, it is not exactly Buddhist, because how we understand meditation is as a part of an integrated path. Without an ethical foundation and without the analysis of the nature of the world that wisdom is focused upon, meditation is just a mental technology for temporary states of, at best, content and happiness, but not a way to liberation, let alone a way to the extraordinary compassion and wisdom of a Buddha. So I talk about that. And then that leads me really into the ninth and final major chapter, which is chapter on wisdom and compassion. Because it's there that, first of all, I identify, as it were, the distinctive characteristics of Mahayana, the great vehicle of Buddhism. And also it allows me to talk about how we so often confuse compassion with sentimentality, and also how compassion absent of wisdom is no compassion at all. So that compassion, rather than being a mere sentiment, a mere feeling, always in a way depends upon clear, hard-headed, realistic thinking about the causes of suffering. So once again, just to abstract compassion or loving kindness from Buddhism and to kind of leave them as an item in themselves falls short of what the Buddha's real teaching was, which is that, in fact, without understanding why we're doing things, without having a clear view of the way the world works, good feelings and good intentions are useless. So that is the last major chapter in the book is about wisdom and compassion. And I close that with a brief explanation of or what is the role of the Vajrayana, of the Tantric teaching, this most skillful way of practicing the Mahayana. So that really, in a way, is in summary what the book is. Why is there a space for Buddhism? Secondly, how we must, to our Buddhism to work on us as individuals and as a society, we must make sure that we don't strangle it before birth by assuming it's the same as our dominant Western ideologies. And how then do we really listen to the message of the Buddha? In a sense, these are the three key elements in this work. So it's different from previous things I've done because it's speaking out more in a way to the general situation. The earlier things I did were, in a way, just kind of very introductions to very traditional accounts of the teaching and so on, which were like kind of preparatory handbooks for a traditional Buddhist education. This is in a way more conversational. I hope that it speaks to people in Tibetan Buddhism, speaks to people in other forms of Buddhism. It even speaks to those outside of the Buddhist tradition who may be interested in general terms in Buddhism, or even speaks to those who are interested and concerned by, well, what is the place of religion or if you really insist, I don't like the word, but if you insist, spirituality, what is there still a place for religious values, for the religious endeavour in the modern world? So I'm even trying to, in a way, reach out to those people and speak to those outside of Buddhism who may nevertheless find some resonances, some similarity with the situation they're in trying to preserve traditional forms of religious practice in the modern world. It's a small book in a way, it's not that long, and therefore consequently it's kind of, but I would suggest it needs kind of fairly careful reading because it's almost like you could say that there's a few new books in every chapter, a few books that could possibly be written out of every chapter. Sometimes I thought even like out of every paragraph there's somebody who's more clever and more brilliant and also less lazy could write a book about that topic alone. So there's lots of potential books really in there that I think could emerge. But that's it. That's really where it is, and I think that I start the book with my meeting with His Holiness Sakya Dechen Ling, and I end really with the fact that the tradition continues, that now this year His Holiness's son Ratna Rinpoche has become the new Sakya Dechen Ling, the new head of our Sakya tradition. So there's a kind of nice kind of cycle that's completed there. But we're just at the beginning, because of course one of the key points that I stress in this book to show the distinctiveness of the Buddhist view is that in Buddhism it's all cycles. That's what the Buddhist system is about, the wheel that is turning. And so although for the last 45 years I've been practicing Dharma, I feel in a way we've returned to the beginning. We're just at the beginning of Dharma in the West. In fact, for us, Western Buddhists, we could almost say we're in the time of Shakyamuni. We're in the time of Lord Buddha himself. He's still teaching in Bodh Gaya. He's still talking about the Four Noble Truths. He's still proclaiming the Bodhisattva vow. He's still proclaiming the teaching of emptiness. And meanwhile, Guru Padmasambhava has been invited to Tibet, where he's going to tame the proud demons of Tibetan culture and convert that culture into an extraordinary repository of the Dharma. So we're at the beginning now in the Dharma in the West. As Eliot said, in my end is my beginning, and that's why I ended the book that way. But I hope by this book that it's at least a small contribution to us getting the Dharma right, because above all else, That's what I think we need to do. The Dharma's perfect. One of the points I keep trying to make in the book is there's nothing needs to be added to the Dharma. As it says about the Buddha nature in Uttara Tantra Shastra, nothing to add, nothing to take away. Well, I feel that about the Dharma. It's absolutely perfect. But we ourselves have got to be in the right place to get that. So my little book is like, how do we get connected with the Dharma properly? If we do, each of us as individuals will be transformed. And if we do, as a larger group, society will begin to be transformed. So my book is really about that. How do we get the Dharma right? So I think that's really all I need to say for now. I believe there's some time for question and answers, a few at least. So I move back now to Benj. Thank you.
Well, Lama Jampa, thank you very much for that. And I hope everyone will join in asking some questions. I'd like to ask one, first of all, about one of the points you mentioned in the book, and you just mentioned it now in talking about the space for Buddhism.
Yeah. Sorry, I was in Paris yesterday. It was extremely, extremely hot, and then I came home on excellent Eurostar, but the aircon was so high, so now I'm kind of dripping in a different way than yesterday. So apologies, sir. So sorry, Ben.
Sorry, I was just asking about talking about the space for Buddhism, and you talk about the Reformation,
yeah.
And you talked about the loss of the spiritual things, that sort of, I think you put it just now as an organic spirituality. For people, and from my own experience, and the word spirituality in itself is something which, as I think you yourself alluded to, something we're a bit uncomfortable with, and then a bit cynical about.
Well, yes, I mean, we're even more kind of disturbed by words like religion, of course. So I think what I want to say is that generally humankind has understood that human life takes place against an extraordinarily vast background. That our individual human life is part of a bigger process. That the idea that this human life is merely an accident caused by physical processes and is ended entirely when those physical processes collapse. That's a very peculiar view in human history. That, as I mentioned, there have been people who believed it, the materialists in ancient India, for instance, or materialists in ancient Greece. But it's not generally been the kind of the understanding which most cultures have. Most cultures see human life taking place, and all life, in fact, if they're Buddhist at least, taking place in this greater cosmic background. Now, in the West, we've kind of, in a way, boxed that into the idea, well, there's a God, there's a creator, there's an author of the universe, there's somebody directing fate, and so on and so forth. That's the Abrahamic inheritance. But there's another type of spirituality, if I say a non-theistic spirituality, which of course is at least partly due to India, but also is present in a way in Chinese culture, which doesn't see the need to personalize that greater kind of reality, that beyond the material reality. It doesn't need to personalize it into terms of a God who is, my apologies to Christians, but in a way seems too much a projection of human longings, of human imagination, rather than anything particularly profound and real. So spirituality, religion in a wider sense, mustn't be understood as just theistic. There's this whole non-theistic spirituality. As I say, in a way, Buddhism is the most obvious representation of that. In short, you don't have to believe in a creator God to be spiritual. You have to see that there's something more profound about life than the merely material. And that the real source of happiness and the real source of suffering, which we wish to be liberated from and liberate others from, is not arising in the merely material circumstances of life. It's arising in a much more profound part of our being, that which finally transcends birth and death. So those are some of the characteristics of a spiritual view of the world. Now, medieval Christianity, which in Eastern Europe meant orthodoxy, in the West meant Catholicism, and of course also dotted in all those places, medieval Judaism as well, although they were all theistic, and therefore in a way from a Buddhist point of view, perhaps not so clear, nevertheless they shared that sense that human life took place in this greater, vaster background, and that it was in some way possible to communicate with that, even if I think they erred in over-personalising it into terms of immortal souls and gods. There was that. So human life had that anchorage, that rootedness in that kind of that vision of the cosmos that for Western Europeans, for instance, you see very clearly in Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, I don't want to return to medieval Christianity for obvious reasons, because I'm not a theist. But I think we lost something at that time. But I think we'll find something even more profound and more rooted in Dharma. Because the abolition of Christianity has left, sorry, abolition is too strong a word, but the retreat from Christianity has left this gaping hole for human beings. They have no source of their values apart from the individual whim or those people who have power. And of course that's a terrible and frightening situation, that that those individuals with power would dominate the rest of the world. It's kind of it's the scene of rampant egoism. It may dress itself up in political ideologies which talk about compassion and fairness and the rest, but essentially it's a worship of naked power. Spirituality counters that, because it comes from a more real, profound source. So it's not that we should return to the Middle Ages, but we have lost something. But that's an opportunity for us to now connect with Dharma. The hole that's been left is a hole in our hearts, in our society, that Dharma, I think, will fill.
I guess people might ask at that stage, well, what is different now compared to the rest of human history, which you talk about when religion, spirituality has been so strong? What is different now is we have reached new levels of material sophistication, which no other humans in history appear to have had.
Well, a small caveat first and then a bigger one. Small caveat is that we don't really know much about what went on prior to Egyptian civilization beginning 4000 BC. But I believe that we're still discovering things, so, what was going on in human civilization at other places, and other times we don't really know. But my main answer is, so the monkey's got new toys to play with. Yes, we have new toys, but do we have deeper wisdom, deeper compassion? Or is it that our cocaine and our computers and all the rest of it, as I say, are just there to serve greed, hatred and delusion? That's the question. So until we solve that problem of what is it that is driving our use of this technology, then the monkey's just got new toys, and he can seriously screw himself up and the world with those new toys.
You talk about wisdom and compassion, and I think in our culture they're seen as something as perhaps quite soft qualities, something that it's good to have but maybe not too much of. And I think and I guess that sort of links in with Buddhism being seen to promote kindness and so on as being linked to a kind of quite unserious religion.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question, because I understand exactly. That many people do assume that Buddhism is just for flower children in a sweet and gentle time, and that we must be hard-headed. But actually, Buddha says we must be hard-headed. No, maybe not hard-headed. Buddha said we must be clear, and that's why in the last chapter I was talking about wisdom and compassion. I specifically deal with this point that compassion must be founded on an accurate understanding of the world. So, for instance, yes, good question. Why should we be compassionate? Well, it's nice. Well, as soon as things get difficult for me, I forget the nice and I privilege myself. So why should we be compassionate? Well, I think most people think they should be compassionate. Why? Well, as Nietzsche would say, out of a decayed Christianity. It's really basically we're running on the gas tank is empty, and people are running on the fumes of that. They call it something else, but it's essentially decayed Christianity. And Christianity and Judaism tell us what? They tell us we should be compassionate because man is made in God's image. That's a very beautiful idea, I think. It's a really profound and beautiful idea. But I just don't think, as Buddhists, that we accept the God business. So that doesn't give us a reason. So why should we be compassionate? Because if we don't know why we should be compassionate, if we don't know why we should be compassionate, if we don't know why this works, compassion will be the first thing to be jettisoned every time things get rough. Oh, I've got to be serious and sensible now. So, sorry, that compassion business, that was just in the 60s. Now we've got to be serious and get down to work. And by the way, that's you for the gulags over there, because the revolution needs some sacrifices. No, actually, why we should be compassionate is because it is grounded in the reality of the world. It's we, the people who think we should emphasize selfishness and our privilege above everybody else's, who are deluded. We don't get the world. We misunderstand the world because we're privileging what is finally a fictitious self based on a misreading of the world. It's not really this me against the world, this me first. Who the hell is this me? Who is this me who is dominant? Who is this me who everybody must serve and everybody must obey, and whose needs are more important than anybody else? Actually, the way the world works is through interdependence. There's no I without you. There's no me without us. This idea that I stand alone and I must privilege myself, which leads me to see half the world as something for me to pillage for my security, and the other half of the world for me to destroy for my security. How has that been working for me? Well, disastrously. Not just in this life, but as we would say in Buddhism, in every other life. In other words, the ego idea, and this being hard-headed, if that's hard-headed, we're crazy. It's completely useless. It leads to my suffering and for me to inflict suffering on others. Whereas if I rethink this and understand my interdependence, my connection with, my indebtedness to the rest of the world, that way real happiness begins to develop. So we say back to the people who say compassion is soft and can easily be dispensed with, no, you're actually mistaken. Compassion is utterly practical, because compassion is based upon interdependence, the interconnection of all beings, of all life in fact. And therefore true happiness for me and for others lies that way. Whereas plan A, me against the world, has brought about only disaster. It's time for plan B. That is the hard-headed, the wise way. And so that's why my chapter is wise compassion. That compassion without intelligence, without thoughtfulness, that's not grounded in an understanding of why compassion is the natural way to be. That compassion is sentimentality, will disappear immediately. But let's not then think that that's all compassion is. Real compassion and wisdom are synonymous. In fact, they're two sides of the same coin. Which coin is interdependence, which is the nature of the world.
So you say we should be compassionate.
Yeah.
We should practice morality.
Yes.
Again, morality. This is. We'll say, well, this is something which enchains us. It holds us back.
Well, you see, in a way, I can understand why people might think that, because they understand morality to be obedience to a fiat, to a kind of a command from on high, from the authority on high, that we must follow these rules and so on. But of course, for us in Dharma, that's not where morality springs from. Then you may say, yes, but Buddhism teaches about, behaving ethically, behaving morally, avoiding this type of action and taking that type of action instead. That's true. But the source of that moral guidelines is not a God, not a creator, not a supreme authority, but a wise person, the Buddha, who has looked at the way the world works, has looked at what are the sources of suffering for oneself and others, and what are the sources of happiness. And based on that dispassionate investigation of the way the world works, how certain causes lead to certain effects, then he suggests, just like a doctor would, practice this, avoid that. So that's where ethics come from, the ethical teachings in Dharma, a strict sense of practicality. What will work for greater human flourishing, for the greater benefit of all beings? Will that lead us to nirvana, to Buddhahood? No, ethics alone won't. But they create the space in which the deeper practices of the spiritual path, meditative contemplation, the development of wisdom, can grow. So I think two things to understand about Buddhist morality. First of all, as I say, it is pragmatic and rooted in good advice rather than being a fiat from on high. And that good advice is based on an analysis of the way the world works. And also it's part of a greater integrated path. Morality, ethics is the first of the three trainings. Ethics, meditation and wisdom. It's not dispensable, but in itself it's not enough. And you see, for instance, to be ethical, it already starts to challenge you to think about, well, why is certain ways of behaving ethical? And that then brings us back to our mind. Because as Nagarjuna said, that which is done from the motivation of greed, hatred and delusion is non-virtuous because it leads to suffering. So we cannot be ethical simply by imitating external behavior, by keeping rules. Keeping the rules from the guidelines of Buddha are a good start, but we have to then look inwards, look into our heart itself to grow ethically. And that leads us inevitably to meditation and to wisdom. So I think, certainly in the West, morality is received some nowadays receives some of the opprobrium previously, heaped up on the immoral. Some things have been reversed, but that is because of if you like, a very unsophisticated understanding of it. And secondly, and here's one of the points I want to make in the book. You see, we use the word morality, we use the word virtue and non-virtue, but don't assume this means exactly the same as, for instance, it would mean in the Christian context. Wonderful though many Christian teachings are, by the way, but it doesn't mean exactly, it doesn't have the same value, because the source of morality is not a creator God. Nor does it mean the same that it might mean in a political context. So it's like I was trying to say, begin at the beginning. And if you're to understand morality in the Buddhist path, understand the Buddhist understanding. Start with there. What did Buddha say about it? What did the great Buddhist masters say? From where does morality come? So although we, for instance, share many patterns of behavior in common with the Christians, their best, like for instance, preservation of life and so on, the source of this is not exactly the same. and that's very important.
I'm conscious of the time, but I also just wanted to open the floor to any questions that anyone may have.
Lama Jampa,
yes.
Thanks very much for this wonderful explanation of the book. You explained how religion has been marginalised over the past few hundred years by materialism and science and enlightenment and so on. But surely that's, I mean, the examples of religious behaviour surrounding us today are often quite shocking enough to put us off religion permanently. I mean, we don't have to look merely at the excesses of Islamists in the Middle East.
No.
But even, when supposedly religious people come to power in India, for example, the Hindu nationalists, who then commit themselves to persecuting the minorities. Unfortunately, Buddhist leaders in places like Burma and Sri Lanka show terrible facets when they come to power.
Yes.
Isn't this an adequate explanation for the reason that people have fed up with religion generally?
No, I think it's part of it, and of course in Europe the 30 years war of religion was quite a decisive stimulus towards the drift towards the Enlightenment. That's true, and there isn't, even in the book I make the point where, when I'm trying to disentangle Buddhism from political assumptions, I do, in a rather light-hearted way, say that those who think, for instance, the solution would be to found a Buddhist political party, a rule according to Buddhism, should perhaps rethink that, because the history of where Buddhist so-called parties or even governments have been in charge is not an unblemished one. So I certainly agree, and I think it's very important for us Western, and we're not being non-traditional here. It is not tradition that there should be a Buddhist political party or a Buddhist ruler. That's just cultural developments that have had, cultural and social developments that have happened. It's not integral to Buddhist teaching. So that's the first thing. And therefore, criticising and calling out so-called Buddhist rulers, I think is absolutely appropriate to do. I think glossing over and covering up where people acting in the name of Buddhism behave badly will not advance us one jot in the West, or anyway, for that matter. It's not just what is advantageous to us. I think common morality, honesty and not lying, which Buddha stressed so much, means we shouldn't cover up these things. So I think if we deal with it honestly, if we're upfront about these things, that will go some way towards creating an understanding in people that it is not the teaching, it is how human beings, who are themselves deluded, like all other sentient beings apart from Buddhas, mishandle things and may misrepresent Buddhism. So it's that we have to point to, that the teachings are perfect, but who among us have applied those teachings perfectly yet to ourselves? The fact that we become angry every day, the fact that we may be meditating for many years and still have irritations and difficulties, in a way is the answer to this. Yes, Buddhists nominally, but not Buddhas, not enlightened beings. Yet in the teaching is a way to perfection, which we can begin today. So, I mean, if one were to elaborate this, one would then say, yes, although I hesitate to do this because just, as it were, directing attention elsewhere, that's what people in power do. They always behave, almost always behave badly. I still think that there can be some moral people in power occasionally, so I don't want to be too anti-political, but it's a tragedy that those who call themselves Buddhists haven't always acted, have in many cases not acted properly. But then they're just deluded people like I am, who may want to practice Buddhism, if I believe in their sincerity, but are falling far short of it.
Unless there's any more questions. Sorry.
I was going to ask, obviously living in the West in quite a multicultural society, there can sometimes be a risk of rifts opening up between people of different religions and different cultures. What do you think is the best way for Buddhists, or indeed anyone of any religion, to go about healing those rifts when they exist?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to tell ourselves is that Buddhism isn't for everybody. I know that sounds funny, but it isn't for everybody right now. People have different karmas, different inclinations, therefore, and Buddhism is for those who want it. You know, the example in Buddha's life was that people had to ask him 3 times before he'd give them any advice. Not out of being precious or anything like that, but just because it's so important that we understand that it's for us if we want it, if we find it useful. So it's funny, now we've got Buddhist centres on street corners, but I still think we should remember that we're here only for those who want us. And not everybody will, and not everybody should. I happen to think Buddhism is the clearest explanation of the nature of the world. But other people may disagree, and other people may find other things that are useful for them. So that's important, to disarm our own tendency to competitiveness and empire building. And, you know, so, and another thing I think is very important to learn is the teaching of Buddha nature. The Buddha nature prompts is there in all beings, Buddhist or non-Buddhist. I mean, they wouldn't call it Buddha nature, obviously, but it may manifest in other people in a way that pushes them towards a different system than us. Great. And whatever teaches kindness and compassion, we should really rejoice in. It's wonderful to see that from whatever source it comes from, a different religion or even non-religion. So we've got plenty of grounds for appreciating and valuing the practices and religious systems and philosophies of others. Buddhism, if one could phrase it like this, Buddhism should merely seek to find its place alongside the other systems. That's enough for Buddhism. And as I say, where we find goodness and kindness in other systems, or even in people who don't have any systems, that is wonderful evidence of Buddha nature. So we should really rejoice in that. I think that's really tremendously important. That doesn't mean to say all religions are one. That would be some horrible kind of soup. They do say distinctive things. And for us to develop wisdom, we must understand what Buddhism is saying that is distinctive. But even there, where we say, well, Buddhism is distinctive, it's non-theistic, it doesn't believe in God, it should always be done out of the sense of clarifying Buddhism for those who need it, not of trying to beat up theists or convert theists to our system. It's just to clarify it for ourselves so we can make use of this wonderful medicine. That's the spirit in which we debate and analyse, and we do so in the Dharma.
Where you have kind of political systems like in Burma and Sri Lanka, which can kind of cause friction between different religions,
yeah.
Do you think prominent religious teachers or prominent religious figures have a role to play in working together?
Sure, they do. I mean, but they do, probably by seeing those commonalities. For instance, in terms of ethics, there's a great deal of commonality between different systems in for instance, the value of human life. So, as much as possible, they should work on those on that common ground. Leave the great philosophical and theological debates alone, maybe, and emphasise that common sense of the value of preserving human life. That then could help to bring their communities together. But of course, it's very easy and comfortable for me to talk about this here. I'm not on the ground in those places. And as you know, Frank Sinatra said, "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread." So this fool isn't going to rush in to say anything more about politics.
Lama Jampa, thank you very much on behalf of everyone for a really illuminating answers to the questions, and indeed the book itself, which is a terrific work, and it's also on sale. In the shop area, so please do get your hands on a copy, priced at £10. Before I close, I've also been asked to mention that this evening our chosen charity to support is the Tibet Foundation. The Tibet Foundation is a UK registered charity that does much good work to support elderly individuals living in poverty in Mongolia, India and Tibet. Money donated tonight to this appeal goes directly to support elderly Tibetans living in poverty in India. So if anyone would like to support this charity, we have some leaflets, or you can leave a cash donation over at the back if you'd like to do that. So that concludes the formal part of the proceedings. Before I thank Lama Jampa one final time, I'd like to invite everyone please to stay for some canapes and some refreshments at the back. Please do enjoy. But once again, Lama Jampa, thank you very much.